among other things lacking in the Constitution or within the federal government itself was the idea of there being a centralized bank that could collect revenues, pay off national debts, create a form of national currency that would be good anywhere in the country, anywhere, and to have an idea that could create a government trust within the populace, create government bonds, various different treasuries. And the Secretary of the Treasury, as nominated by George Washington at the time, was again that dude, Alexander Hamilton, the guy in the $10 bill. Alexander Hamilton was a staunch Federalist. He believed in a strong centralized government. He also believed that by having a strong centralized government, Hamilton believed that you would create strong national leaders at this time, and you would create a veritable aristocracy, if you will, an elite ruling class in the country that would help pay for things nationally, but also wield significant influence within the country. And in doing so, by creating this elite ruling class, you would have wealthy and powerful people who would be invested in the success of government. Okay? A lot of people took opposition to that. But the idea, therefore, was that existing public debt could be funded by way of creating a national bank that could take care of America's indebtedness and would give power to Congress, the power of the purse, in order to pay off and levy how things are paid off. So the Treasury would pay for things as dictated by how Congress said as much. So you have wealthy speculators at the time who allied with Alexander Hamilton in a possible creation of a national bank. You had staunch opposition because several of the different ways that Alexander Hamilton proposed creating revenues was to levy taxes on whiskey. Okay. So you're going to see at this point alcoholic beverages, those taxes become burdensome for distillers. And also, if you're a farmer out in more rural areas creating the corn and wheat to make these alcoholic beverages that are going to be taxed, you're also going to pay out the wazoo. Okay. So Alexander Hamilton also had the idea that he would levy tariffs on international product so as to help domestic industries from foreign competition. Donald Trump seems to like tariffs a lot himself too. Okay. Otherwise, though, if you have a healthy manufacturing sector, you're going to have an overall healthy economy, one that collects revenues based upon taxes, and one that offers opportunity for more stable government. Okay. So with a wealthy ruling class, you would have a thriving commercial economy and a thriving manufacturing sector. Think about that. A wealthy ruling class, a thriving commercial sector, and a thriving manufacturing sector. I wonder who would support that. Otherwise, though, there was opposition, as I mentioned. Okay, so eventually, Hamilton's vision was eventually passed. The Bank of the United States began operations in 1791. George Washington signed off on that, even though there was staunch opposition from some of the other folks who wielded a big stick as well. But before it was passed, something had to happen. Alexander Hamilton believed that the United States Treasury could assume debt from various different states. What does that mean to assume? In other words, the United States would now take on the debt that states had racked up. Okay? Well, what if your state has a lot less debt than the other state next over to you? How is that fair? Because that's what happened. Alexander Hamilton proposed that the U.S. Treasury assume debts from states. Massachusetts had a sizable state debt. Virginia had a very low state debt. Virginia was also a very populous state at the time. Virginians gave heavy pushback to Alexander Hamilton and his idea for a centralized bank if they were going to be basically punished for not going into debt. Okay. Alexander Hamilton had to placate the Virginians. Virginia at the time was the most populous state. Philadelphia was deemed as capital. Well, how about we make a deal with Virginia? Virginia, if you support a national bank, the first bank of the United States, centralized treasury, will move the capital to a point of your choosing. Interesting. And it was then George Washington located an area along the Potomac River, which separates Virginia and Maryland. Okay, kind of in a hot, swampy, humid area. Okay. Not that far from Mount Vernon, where George Washington's property was, by the way. How convenient. In order to placate Virginia's fears of debt and assumption thereof, and in creation of the Bank of the United States, the United States capital would be moved from Philadelphia to a new place along the Potomac to later be deemed Washington, D.C. Okay? Right next to Virginia. You're right there. The power of the capital is no longer up northeast. Now you're back more centralized within the original colonies, specifically close to Virginia. Okay. Well, also at the time, I mentioned earlier that Hamilton's vision would be creation of an elite ruling class based on a vibrant commercial economy and a thriving manufacturing sector, which is great, but he saw staunch opposition. Enter in Thomas Jefferson. You know, the guy who wrote the world's greatest breakup letter, the Declaration of Independence. That guy's back again. Thomas Jefferson believes that the United States should not have aristocracy. That's what they fought against. They didn't want to have an aristocracy. A wealthy elite ruling class, even though Thomas Jefferson would come from such ilk, was against the idea of a new American. Thomas Jefferson liked the idea of a commercial economy and there being commercial interests in manufacturing. He was not opposed to that. He just did not want the entire economy to be based on such. He believed that America was still more of a rural and agrarian-based country. It's where you would have thriving seaports, but you would also have Americans that could subsist upon their own and not depend on a central government or central authority to exist. More of a subsistent style of living. That was Thomas Jefferson's vision for the country. And if you go by way of what Alexander Hamilton wanted, that vision and most Americans would kind of be left behind. Raises kind of a good point. So what you're starting to see here is a difference in a political approach to government. You're starting to develop political ideologies. Groups of people with varying political interests and economic interests. In this case, wealthy elite ruling class, commercial economy, thriving manufacturing, as opposed to the common folks getting by all on their own in an agrarian style. You see two large diversions in political thought. I wonder how that might affect politics today. Okay? What you start to see is the emergence of a group of people who refer to themselves as Democratic Republicans, or Republicans for short. Now, the Republicans of the era of Thomas Jefferson in this late 1790s context is not the same as the Republican Party that you know today. Today's Republican Party, the Grand Old Party, was inaugurated in the 1850s. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican of modern era. Okay? The Republicans of the 1790s were different, but they're reasonably similar in some beliefs in that Americans can be self-sustaining and agrarian-based and not have a ruling class, a wealthy elitist form, if you will. And in order to kind of placate differences between Republicans and Federalists, something would have to give by way of a second presidential term. George Washington would be elected president for the second term. But in doing so, he raised a few eyebrows. He raised the idea that there are Americans with differing political views, and they're developing factions, a political party, if you will, that could be potentially dangerous, that could split our country. I wonder whether that rings true. Some things 200 some odd years later, yeah, our country in 2020 is exceptionally divided. Okay? We like to say that we're united, and in the post 9/11 era, our country was definitely on the same page. Didn't matter if you're white, black, woman, man, wealthy, poor, whatever you were all deemed the same by the people who crashed into the towers on 9/11. Didn't matter if you're a Democrat, Republican, whichever you were. Okay? We're all the same. George Washington was very wise in speaking, in becoming beware of political factions. They could be very divisive. And in this case, they are. But it was inevitable. The idea of political parties gained traction during this era in American history as economic and political differences grew. Those who favored more commercial and manufacturing sectors, and those who favored more agrarian and self-sustaining sectors. Those who feared a tyrannical government. Those who believed a central government was necessary for us to be glued all together. You see a lot of division back then that lays the groundwork and plants the seeds for division in American history ever since that time. Since our colonial days, America has been different. People came to British North America to flee religious persecution. There was persecution among the colonies. People had different political and economic interests back then. Slaves were introduced, indentures, eventually independence movements that bound everybody together. But it would be inevitable that our differences would rear their heads again. Since our earliest days as a country, we have always been divided. So yeah, we are the United States of America. But one of the things that makes us great, pardon Donald Trump's pun, is that you can have a differing opinion. You can have a different political opinion than your neighbor. That's the beauty of this country. You can believe something different. You're perfectly in your right to do so. As long as it does not endanger anybody else, you should be allowed to speak your opinion. You're guaranteed that under the First Amendment in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But political factions gained power around this time, and things haven't changed since then.